Welcome back. In this video, let's talk about all the tools we can use to actually run our tests. Remember, our tests are just JavaScript. So we could just write simple JavaScript files with maybe if statements that says, if the sum function adds these two numbers together, then return success, otherwise return test failed. So we could do that, but that's tedious, and as developers, we want to use existing tools to make our experience or our speed of development faster. So this is going to get overwhelming, but let's look at testing tools. I tried to organize for you a way to think about tests and the testing environment in the web development land. So I'm going to explain this, and if this is a little complicated at first, don't worry. We're going to come back to this and go over this at the end of the section. It's all going to make sense. So the very first thing we need in a testing tool is something called a testing library. Pretty self-explanatory. This is the scaffolding, giving us the ability to use some function calls and some new methods for us to actually write our tests. Again, think of this as scaffolding or building the structure around our tests. Probably the top three libraries for that is Jasmine, there's Jest, and then there's something called Mocha. And like I said, these are just npm install libraries, so they're available on npm, and you can add them to build your scaffolding. The next thing that you need right over here is something called an assertion library. And in here we have, again, Jasmine that comes with its own assertion library. We have Jest, once again, that comes with its own assertion library. And then Chai here that usually gets paired with Mocha in order to have an assertion library. An assertion library provides functions that are assertion functions. I know that's confusing. It's essentially a tool to allow you to test that the variables contain the expected value. Now, that still sounds confusing, so let me show you. We're on the Chai assertion library here, and you can see over here that they use something called BDD, or Behavioral Driven Development. And by installing this library, we can use all these words, and they just look like basic English. What an assertion library does is says, expect that this object that just contains A equals 1, and then it chains all these words together to test our assumption. So let's say, expect that this object to not have property B. It reads like English, right? It simply tests condition 1 against condition 2. So this is going to return false because you're right, this object won't have property B. And they have a lot of things that we can add. We see that another one is expect this object to have all keys A and B. It kind of reads like English. And this makes our test really easy to read and understand. The next thing we need for our test is something called a test runner. And a test runner is something that allows us to run our tests. Remember, if we go back to our app, we had to do npm run test. And this runs our test. Let's press A to run all the tests. And something is magically running all these tests. That's what a test runner does. Going back to our slide again, we now see that Jasmine and Jest include a test runner in their library. And then Mocha also has its own test runner. And then I've added another one over here, which is called karma.js. And this allows you to run tests in the browser. What does that mean? Well, a test runner can run tests in different environments. Let's have a look. You see, usually our JavaScript works with the DOM to make our web app what it is. But when we're running tests, and this is what Karma does, allows you to run your tests on the browser. But why wouldn't we just always run our tests on the browser? Well, that is because it takes a lot of time. We have to run every single test through the browser using the browser APIs. Ideally, when we run tests, it's super quick because most tests are set up so that if a developer hits save on their terminal, it's going to run the tests. If every time they needed to start up the browser and run through everything, well, that would be really slow. So other options exist, such as Puppeteer by Google, which is what we call a headless browser. It's a Node library which provides a high-level API to control the headless version of their browser. So think of it as a stripped-down browser that makes your tests a little bit faster. But it can also be configured to do things such as generate screenshots, PDFs of pages. It can automate form submissions. You can do UI testing with it. You can monitor keyboard input. You can do a lot of cool things with it. And then finally, we have something called JS DOM. And JS DOM, as the name suggests, is an in JavaScript implementation of the DOM. So it's not the real DOM, but a fake JavaScript version of it. And remember, the DOM is that tree-like structure that shows the nodes on our webpage. And that's what makes up our UI. So JS DOM implements this in JavaScript, so we can have a DOM-like API to work without actually needing the browser. If we go back to our tests, and let's run this again. I'm going to run npm run test. You'll see over here that React scripts test --env. It went by quickly, but you saw that we are using JS DOM there, so that our tests run really quick. All right. So that's a test runner. Next, we have something called mock, spies, and stubs. And in here, again, Jasmine and Jess come with their own version. And then if you're using something like Mocha, just like you had to add an assertion library, you'll have to add something called signon.js. There are obviously other libraries, but this is the most popular. Now, what's all this mock, spies, and stub business? Well, spies provide for us information about functions. How many times they were called, in what cases, and by whom. Stubbing replaces selected functions with a function to ensure that the expected behavior happens. And then mocks is kind of like faking a function or a behavior to test different parts of a process. So this might be really good for integration tests. Now, I know that can get a little bit confusing, so let's take a look at Signon. Signon over here, if you go to their documentation, let's click on stubs. If we scroll down, we see that, what is a stub doing? We're simply using the library signon.stub, which is a function. Now we can use it in a way where this function can be called with arguments 42 and make it return 1, so that when we run callback 42, it returns 1. And when we do callback dot with args, it throws an error. Again, this is something that we'll go over later in the videos, but you see here that stub is we can fake functions and make them do what they expect. For example, sign-on can be used to fake a server during our tests. We don't necessarily want to send requests to the server every time we're running tests, but ideally, if a function is using a server, we can fake it with a stub so that the function still runs and we can just test that one piece of code. Like I said, this is really hard to explain without a little bit of a demo, but don't worry, we're going to get there. And then the final piece of the puzzle. We've talked about scaffolding, about assertion libraries. We talked about test runners. We talked about these stubs, mocks, and spies. Finally, we have something called code coverage. And code coverage is provided by libraries like Istanbul. Jest has code coverage already included, but has actually Istanbul running underneath the hood. And let me show you what a code coverage might look like. Luckily for us, we can just do npm test -- coverage. And don't worry, we'll talk about how we can do this in our apps. But if I run this, you see the JS DOM here, I get an outputted file of the coverage. And you see over here that I have my RoboFriends app. And I have some greens, some reds, some yellows. And this is a test coverage that shows me what percentage of the statements, the branches, the functions are covered with tests. You see here that I've written some tests for the constants.js file, some actions.js file, and also for some of our components, some of our card list components, and that we have 100% coverage for those. But then we also have things like the header.js file that is missing some tests, and it even shows us which lines we're missing tests in. And that is Istanbul underneath the hood, giving us a report of where we're missing tests. Now, although these are a lot of libraries, they all have the same goal in mind, and they all actually are written in very similar fashion. So once you know one, it is really, really easy to pick up another one. Don't get overwhelmed by this. Just like with anything, there's a lot of tools for the job, but we'll come back to this so it all makes sense in the end. Just keep in mind that the syntaxes are very similar, so you'll be just fine. And I also want to let you know that probably the most popular, Jasmine used to be very popular, but it has now been overtaken by two things. One is Jest. As you can see, Jest is nice because it has everything in one place. You can just install this library and have all these little features that you need in a testing framework. Another popular one is Mocha combined with Chai and Sign-On. And this is, again, probably the most popular setup, but that's also because Jest is a lot newer. Most of these libraries follow the idea of behavioral-driven development, which is we describe what a function does and say what behavior we expect out of them. You remember the Chai assertion, right? If object has this properties, we expect it to have this property A. All right, does your head hurt yet? Luckily for us, if it wasn't for Create React App, we would have to npm install all of these again, set them up, and add them to our npm scripts to run all these tests and test coverages. But as you can see with Create React App, we have everything out of the box. Again, the best minds in the community are working on maintaining Create React App to always keep it up to date as all of these libraries update as well. Don't worry though, I'll show you in the upcoming videos how to actually set this up yourself as well. One other note. In our tests over here, Create React App uses Jest, and that's because Jest was created by Facebook. And if you remember, React was also developed by Facebook, which is kind of nice because they use it in their own production environment, and these tools are used together to work really, really nicely. And by the way, there's other testing libraries. We have Ava that does parallelism really, really well, which means it runs tests really, really fast. And then you have something like Tape that is really low-level, simple, light library. But as I said before, don't get overwhelmed. In short, if you get anything from this video, is that if you just want to get started and looking for a fast framework that can handle everything and has everything in one, well, just use Jest. If you want very flexible, extendable configuration where you can plug in some things, then use Mocha. Mocha is a little harder to set up because of all these things that we need to add on, but it's more flexible and, like I said, open to extensions. One last note. In our test, we're going to use two things that are sort of unique to React. One is something called snapshot testing that comes with Jest, which allows us to do some really cool things that I'm going to show you later on. And then another library called Enzyme, which was created by Airbnb and helps us write tests better for React components. Don't worry, I'm not just showing you these things because I think they're cool and trendy. These are implemented in most React projects that you'll encounter. And it's pretty much become the standard in the React ecosystem to use these libraries. So we're going to use them too. At the end of the day though, we can agree on one thing. All these libraries have really cool logos. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.